Here is a critical detail that no one at any official press briefing has adequately addressed today. Pakistan recently dispatched its army chief to Tehran, keeping him stationed there for 3 full days. Concurrently, the Turkish president has openly declared that he is personally driving initiatives to de-escalate tensions and prolong the current ceasefire. Over in Egypt, officials have been actively shuttling messages back and forth between Washington and Tehran ever since this conflict erupted. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia welcomed both Pakistan's Prime Minister and its Field Marshal, praising their diplomatic efforts and sending them off with full Saudi backing for the negotiation process. What we are witnessing involves 4 major nations. Weeks of relentless shuttle diplomacy, countless flights, high-stakes phone calls, public displays of affection on airport tarmacs, and lengthy 45-minute conversations between heads of state. Consider the sheer scale of this effort. Pakistan's Prime Minister embarked on a grueling tour of 3 capitals in just 4 days, visiting Jeddah, Doha, and Antalya, with the explicit goal of building a robust consensus for a sustained dialogue process. His military chief spent 3 distinct days in Tehran, hand-delivering a fresh message straight from Washington. Yet, despite all of this unprecedented pressure, Iran has not offered a single definitive yes to any of them. There has been no formal agreement, no scheduled date, and 0 confirmation of any attending delegation. In fact, the Iranian Foreign Ministry explicitly stated they have no plans to attend, while state media dismissed the proposed talks as a mere media spectacle. To further complicate matters, Iran's judiciary chief announced today that the Islamic Republic will undeniably retaliate against the ongoing blockade, all while the ceasefire is set to expire by Wednesday evening. Mainstream coverage continues to treat this entire ordeal as a simple scheduling conflict, pushing the narrative that the talks are perpetually on the verge of happening. The underlying assumption is that if everyone simply pushes a little harder, something magical will fall into place before the Wednesday deadline. However, that entire framework is fundamentally flawed. Iran's unwavering refusal to yield to 4 highly active mediating nations is absolutely not a scheduling hiccup. It is a meticulously crafted strategic posture. Grasping exactly why Tehran can comfortably maintain this defiant stance, even as 4 of the region's most influential diplomatic powerhouses practically beg them to negotiate, is the essential key to understanding the reality of today's geopolitical landscape. To truly comprehend the depth of this failure, we must first break down the staggering level of effort each country poured into this initiative. Let us start with Pakistan. Army Chief Asim Munir, the very man personally praised by Trump during his ceasefire announcement, flew directly to Tehran for a 3-day mission. During his stay, he held face-to-face meetings with President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Araghchi, and Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, the latter having previously led Iran's delegation in Islamabad. Munir even met with the head of Iran's military central command. The exceptionally warm embrace Araghchi gave Munir right on the tarmac was far beyond standard diplomatic protocol. It was a highly intentional signal, reflecting a back-channel relationship that both nations are desperately trying to keep alive. Pakistani officials explicitly noted that Munir was carrying a new, substantive message from Washington, not just empty pleasantries. This marked the most senior Pakistani military presence in Iran since the hostilities commenced. Even before Munir's departure, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had already spent 4 exhausting days rallying support in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, engaging directly with the Crown Prince, the Emir, and Erdogan's inner circle to forge a unified front for dialogue. Following this, Sharif engaged in a direct 45-minute phone call with President Pezeshkian. Pakistan's stance remains crystal clear. They are fully prepared to host, all security measures are locked down, and the diplomatic table is set. Furthermore, Iran's ambassador previously confirmed that Tehran would absolutely not accept any alternative venue. In short, Pakistan has executed every possible maneuver a mediator could attempt. Then we have Turkey. President Erdogan has stated publicly, using very deliberate language, that he is actively transmitting necessary suggestions and executing concrete initiatives to lower the temperature, stretch the ceasefire, and keep the dialogue alive. This is a sitting head of state openly defining his real-time mediation efforts. Turkey deliberately co-hosted the Antalya Diplomacy Forum to construct a multilateral umbrella, effectively giving Tehran a face-saving way out. The logic is simple. If a coalition of nations collectively presses Iran, Tehran can frame its compliance as responding to regional partners rather than buckling under American dominance. Turkey has successfully played this nuanced role in the past, and Iranian leadership fully understands the gravity when Erdogan claims personal involvement in conveying terms. Simultaneously, Egypt has deployed its most seasoned diplomats and intelligence personnel to serve as crucial conduits between American and Iranian officials throughout this crisis. This quiet but vital involvement has been verified by analysts at Carnegie and reporters at NPR. Egypt famously avoids holding flashy press conferences about its mediation tactics. Instead, they do the grinding work in the shadows, carefully adjusting language, testing boundaries, and softening extreme positions long before anyone actually sits down at a table. With Egypt heavily involved, the Arab world's most populous and diplomatically savvy nation is dedicating its immense resources to securing an Iranian agreement. Finally, we look at Saudi Arabia. Reports from the Wall Street Journal indicate that Riyadh is applying direct, intense pressure on Washington to completely lift the current blockade. They are not making gentle suggestions. They are demanding action. This urgency stems from a stark warning delivered straight from Tehran. If the blockade persists, absolutely no maritime port in the entire region will remain safe. A top Iranian military commander chillingly declared that security in the Persian Gulf is an all-or-nothing proposition. It either exists for everyone or it exists for no one. Consequently, Saudi Arabia graciously hosted Munir and Sharif, commended their constructive actions, and threw its full weight behind the diplomatic push. In Jeddah, the Crown Prince purposely used the word constructive to describe Pakistan's efforts, which is high-level diplomatic code for absolute endorsement and a plea to keep going. Saudi Arabia is caught in a multi-directional crossfire here. The kingdom hosts critical American military installations and relies heavily on US security umbrellas. At the same time, they are forced to watch Iran threaten to obliterate every shipping terminal and oil refinery in the Gulf if the conflict reignites. Ironically, the very nation that this entire geopolitical struggle was ostensibly designed to protect is now the loudest voice desperately lobbying for immediate de-escalation. When you step back and evaluate this alliance, the magnitude is undeniable. Pakistan offers the trusted neutral ground and a respected military liaison. Turkey brings Erdogan's unparalleled credibility, bridging the Islamic world and the West. Egypt supplies the region's most effective clandestine communication networks. And Saudi Arabia delivers the immense financial and strategic leverage of the Gulf's undisputed heavyweight, possessing the most acute vulnerability to renewed Iranian aggression. Combined, this quartet forms the most comprehensive, credible, and aggressive mediation task force ever mobilized to resolve a standoff between Washington and Tehran. Yet, despite this monumental pressure, Iran has resolutely refused to say yes to any of them. This is the hard truth that global media outlets continuously attempt to downplay. We are not dealing with a bureaucratic delay or a minor scheduling friction. Tehran has received the formal invitations, listened to the impassioned pleas, fully calculated the monumental stakes, and still authorized its foreign ministry to declare publicly that they have zero plans to participate. State media openly mocks the process. The judiciary promises retaliation against the blockade, and the clock is relentlessly ticking down toward a Wednesday evening expiration of the ceasefire. So, the glaring question that major news networks refuse to dissect is simply this: how exactly can Iran afford to reject such an overwhelming diplomatic coalition? The answer lies in the exact same structural reality that has defined this conflict from day one. Iran possesses such massive external backing that the immediate cost of defiance has not yet surpassed the humiliating cost of accepting Washington's demands. Crucially, this external life support is not coming from Islamabad, Ankara, or Cairo. It is flowing directly from Beijing. This economic lifeline is the ultimate mechanism of survival. The cardinal rule of this mechanism is straightforward. As long as Chinese energy purchases supply Iran with enough economic oxygen to stay afloat, every single invitation from a desperate mediator remains entirely optional. Right at this very moment, China is in the process of purchasing a staggering 157.7 million barrels of Iranian crude oil, which is currently sitting on the water. While the American blockade successfully forced 27 vessels to turn back from Iranian ports, it has completely failed to halt a single barrel destined for the Chinese market. Yes, Iran's petroleum revenues have taken a hit, and their currency has plunged by 15%. The central bank even privately warned the president that full economic recovery might take a grueling 12 years. That economic pain is undeniably real, but pain does not equal systemic collapse. The critical buffer preventing that collapse is a sophisticated network engineered by Beijing, utilizing a massive dark fleet of tankers, alternative yuan-based payment structures, and the ever-present shield of a United Nations Security Council veto. Official Chinese customs data predictably shows zero imports originating from Iran. Yet, conveniently, China's recorded intake of supposedly Malaysian crude oil has surged to 1.3 million barrels per day, a figure that is more than double the entire national production capacity of Malaysia itself. The reality is blatantly obvious. This is Iranian oil, deceptively relabeled, transferred ship to ship in open waters, and quietly processed by independent Chinese refineries completely off the official books. This resilient system was meticulously constructed during the heavy sanction years, and this current war merely dragged it into the daylight. The American blockade is powerless against it because the official language issued by Central Command purposely exempts vessels sailing to non-Iranian destinations. That specific phrasing was drafted to ensure American naval forces would not have to intercept Chinese tankers, thereby avoiding a disastrous superpower confrontation right before a crucial diplomatic summit in May. The statistics are mind-boggling. Prior to this war, Tehran was pushing out 1.68 million barrels of oil every single day. Yet, during the absolute bloodiest weeks of this conflict, with the Strait of Hormuz effectively paralyzed and American aerial bombardments reaching their absolute zenith, Iran miraculously managed to export 1.84 million barrels per day. They literally sold more oil while under intense fire than they did in peacetime. How does a nation achieve this after suffering the assassination of its supreme leader on the very first day, having its nuclear infrastructure pummeled and its aerial defense networks systematically dismantled? The only logical answer is the impenetrable financial and logistical fortress that Beijing spent a decade building to withstand this exact scenario of extreme Western pressure. Furthermore, investigative reporting from the Financial Times, utilizing leaked intelligence, confirmed that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps heavily relied on high-resolution satellite imagery provided by a Chinese commercial entity known as Earth Eye Company to precisely target American military installations, including Prince Sultan Air Base, Muwafaq Salti Air Base, and strategic coordinates near the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. China literally gave Iran the eyes needed to strike American assets with devastating accuracy, a fact independently corroborated by CBS News through multiple US officials. As long as this covert machinery continues to operate, Tehran breathes easily. And a nation that can breathe can comfortably look four panicking mediators in the eye and say, "Not today." This strategic oxygen supply became even more vital just this morning, following a direct communication from Moscow. Foreign Minister Lavrov publicly affirmed Russia's steadfast commitment to help resolve the crisis and facilitate an acceptable arrangement between Tehran and the Gulf states. In swift return, Iran officially guaranteed the unimpeded and secure passage of all Russian maritime vessels navigating through the highly volatile Strait of Hormuz. We are witnessing two heavily sanctioned nations exchanging incredibly specific, mutually beneficial commitments. Moscow secures an ironclad guarantee for its shipping lanes, while Tehran acquires an invaluable layer of geopolitical armor. It is incredibly telling that on the exact same morning, Iran was aggressively batting away every single invitation from the mediating coalition. They were simultaneously reassuring Moscow about the future of Hormuz. That profound asymmetry in their diplomatic engagements reveals exactly how the Iranian regime categorizes its international relationships in this critical hour. We must also clarify exactly what these desperate mediators are demanding Iran to accept, because the general media narrative frames this as a standard plea for peaceful dialogue. It is anything but standard. The chasm between what the coalition is asking and what Tehran is willing to concede is massive and highly specific. It has been locked in place since late February. The American ultimatum, channeled through these four nations, revolves around two absolute non-negotiables. First, a total and permanent halt to all nuclear enrichment activities. Trump has reiterated to every journalist willing to listen that preventing a nuclear weapon is 99% of his focus. His officials have echoed this in Islamabad, demanding a binding, affirmative pledge that Iran will never pursue the bomb nor acquire the infrastructure to rapidly construct one. Second, Washington demands that the Strait of Hormuz remain perpetually open under strict rules of free international navigation, completely stripping Iran of any recognized sovereign authority over those waters. Tehran, conversely, demands a managed navigation system where passing vessels must coordinate directly with Iranian maritime authorities, allowing Iran to retain absolute operational control and continue extracting lucrative transit tolls. These deeply entrenched positions have not shifted a single inch since the last round of talks. American representatives may claim the two sides are 80% of the way to an agreement, but that remaining 20% is not a trivial administrative detail. It represents the existential core of the conflict. Will Iran survive this war as an independent power capable of enriching uranium and policing its own maritime borders, or will it emerge completely neutered, having surrendered its sovereignty to American demands? Beneath these two glaring issues lies a third, often ignored layer of complexity. Iran's comprehensive counterproposal, submitted long before the Islamabad meetings, included demands for massive financial war reparations, ironclad security guarantees preventing future attacks from American or Israeli forces, and absolute international acknowledgement of their sovereign dominion over Hormuz. Washington has offered absolutely zero public response to these sweeping demands. No formal rejection, no alternative compromise, just deafening silence. Consequently, Tehran views the situation through a lens of profound grievance. We offered a diplomatic framework, and in return, you slapped us with a devastating blockade, hijacked our commercial vessels, and threatened to reignite a massive military campaign if we do not immediately capitulate. Now, you deploy 4 allied nations to drag us back to a negotiating table that you have intentionally transformed into a stage for our unconditional surrender, and you have the audacity to call it diplomacy. Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf articulated this exact sentiment flawlessly, stating that the American administration is actively trying to convert the dialogue into a platform for surrender, or using it as a convenient excuse to justify further military aggression. This is not merely fiery rhetoric designed to appease local hardliners. It is the precise, calculated assessment of the massive ideological gap as understood by Iran's top negotiators. President Pezeshkian reinforced this on Monday, noting that a profound, historically rooted mistrust of American behavior continues to poison the atmosphere, and that the hostile signals emanating from Washington carry a deeply bitter undertone aimed solely at total capitulation. He firmly declared that the Iranian people will never submit to brute force, making this the official stance of the civilian leadership on the very day the foreign ministry formally rejected the upcoming talks. When both the civilian administration and the formidable military apparatus align so perfectly in their public defiance, the four frantic nations trying to pull Iran into Pakistan are facing a monumental crisis that goes far beyond a simple scheduling issue. They are dealing with a regime that has meticulously calculated that the catastrophic internal political backlash of submitting to American terms in Islamabad far outweighs the external dangers of simply walking away. Now, in the interest of absolute fairness, let us examine the optimistic counter-argument, the belief that the mediators might actually pull off a last-minute miracle, because this perspective does hold some historical weight. The core of this optimistic view relies on Iran's notorious track record of aggressive brinkmanship. Historically, Tehran never confirms its diplomatic intentions until the absolute final second. Prior to the first round of talks, their official narrative was identical. No plans to attend. Yet, they eventually showed up with a massive delegation of 70 negotiators. The stark contradiction between various Iranian officials regarding their attendance is a familiar, chaotic pattern. Optimists argue that the public refusals are merely theatrical posturing designed for leverage, not an irrevocable final decision. They point out that Iran's ambassador previously stressed they would only negotiate in Pakistan, implying the current friction is merely haggling over the specific terms of their arrival rather than a blanket boycott. Furthermore, having four heavy-hitting nations acting simultaneously is not necessarily a sign of impending failure. It signifies a coordinated, maximum-pressure diplomatic campaign operating at a scale previously unseen in this conflict. Pakistan's reputation as an honest broker remains largely untarnished. The emotional embrace between Munir and Arakchi was not staged for the cameras. It demonstrated a vital, functional back channel that both governments are highly motivated to protect. Add to this the intriguing comments from Turkey's top diplomat on CNN, hinting heavily that the Wednesday deadline will inevitably be pushed back, suggesting Ankara possesses classified intelligence, indicating that the deadline is merely a pressure tactic, not an apocalyptic trigger. Finally, Trump himself boasted this morning that the conceptual framework of the deal is essentially finished. That specific terminology usually indicates that the heavy lifting is done and only the granular details remain unresolved. It is entirely plausible that the mediation coalition has already secretly presented enough concessions to Tehran, and that Iran is simply waiting for a token American gesture regarding the blockade, allowing the regime to spin their eventual attendance as a massive diplomatic victory rather than a shameful surrender. This optimistic Steelman argument is highly compelling because it perfectly aligns with Iran's historical modus operandi of masking pragmatic compromises behind walls of fiery public rhetoric. The hidden channels are buzzing, Pakistan's leverage is still potent, and securing a last-minute extension before Wednesday night is mathematically and politically possible. However, this optimistic outlook completely ignores a devastating reality. Every single previous wave of extreme pressure has successfully forced movement up to that critical 80% threshold, only to violently crash into a brick wall. The process stalls not because Iran lacks the bureaucratic skill to draft a treaty, but because that final 20% is not a technical hurdle, it is a fundamental clash of existence. Speaker Ghalibaf summarized the deadlock perfectly on camera. They have absolutely zero trust in the opposing side. This is not a dispute over wording, it is a catastrophic deficit of faith. And frankly, every aggressive maneuver authorized by Washington since the Islamabad meetings has only violently validated the darkest paranoid warnings of Iran's most extreme hardliners. Washington enforced a strangling blockade. While a ceasefire was supposed to be active, they seized commercial assets and they continuously moved the goalposts regarding their nuclear demands. The internal narrative in Tehran is simple. If you give these people an inch, they will aggressively take 2 miles. 4 well-intentioned mediators cannot magically repair a shattered foundation of trust that the United States actively destroys with every new tactical escalation. Pakistan cannot extract a binding agreement when America's own aggressive posture makes it politically suicidal for Iran's fragile power structure to sign on the dotted line. Moreover, there is an inescapable structural nightmare within Iran's domestic politics that the optimists gloss over. The powerful Revolutionary Guard has effectively paralyzed President Pezeshkian's political appointments and built an impenetrable security fortress around Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the supreme leader. The very faction inside Tehran that most violently despises any compromise with the West is currently holding the absolute keys to the kingdom. When the Revolutionary Guard dictates who gets to speak to the supreme leader while simultaneously suffocating the civilian government's authority, those 4 nations desperately trying to lure Iran to Pakistan are essentially begging the wrong people. Foreign Minister Arakchi might physically board an airplane, but it is the Revolutionary Guard that dictates what his pen is allowed to sign. As we hurtle toward the Wednesday evening deadline, there are 3 critical indicators you must monitor. First, pay intense attention to Iran's judiciary chief. If he acts on his explicit threat to unleash definitive retaliation against the overarching American blockade, independent of any specific maritime seizures, the ceasefire is effectively dead, regardless of whatever empty promises the mediators might whisper. If this kinetic response happens after Wednesday, it signals the violent opening salvo of the next phase of the war. The sheer magnitude of that strike will reveal whether Tehran has reached the terrifying conclusion that their window of opportunity is rapidly slamming shut, and that preemptive devastation is their only viable survival strategy. Second, look for any ironclad official declaration from the mediating coalition confirming a named Iranian delegation. Disregard anonymous leaks to eager journalists or shadowy private signals. Demand a formal public announcement that a specific high-ranking Iranian official is airborne and headed to Islamabad. The historical precedent here dictates that such confirmations usually drop mere hours before touchdown. If Tuesday vanishes without this formal acknowledgement, then Wednesday ceases to be a window for negotiation and transforms into a hard, unforgiving deadline. Scrutinize carefully whether the announcement names Arakchi or Ghalibaf. If Arakchi travels alone, the diplomatic wing is merely going through the motions. If Ghalibaf leads the charge, the Revolutionary Guard has officially sanctioned the mission. If both men appear together, we are witnessing a genuine, desperate lunge for a permanent deal. If only one shows up, rest assured the opposing faction is sharpening its knives in the shadows.